you ever noticed how often morality gets reduced to rule keeping? How being good is treated as obedience to the right authority rather than the courage to think, choose, and live honestly? We're often told that virtue comes from following the rules, but we're rarely asked what's shaping our intentions, our words, or the quiet decisions no one else sees. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time, we'll explore the tension between external authority and internal integrity, and what these ancient texts suggest about moral maturity, personal responsibility, and the power of an honest inner life. In this episode, we're asking a challenging question. What happens when we stop outsourcing our conscience to tradition, power, or religious certainty and start taking responsibility for the choices, thoughts, and words that actually shape our lives? Because if morality only works when it's enforced, it's probably not morality at all. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Sirach. It's chapter 15, verses 15 through 20. Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians. It's chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. It's chapter 5, verses 20 through 22a, verses 27 and 28, verses 33 and 34a, and verse 37. Now, we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Sirach. If you choose, you can keep the commandments, and to act faithfully is a matter of your choice. He has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whichever you choose. Before each person are life and death, and whichever one chooses will be given. For great is the wisdom of the Lord. He is mighty in power and sees everything. His eyes are on those who fear him, and he knows every human action. He has not commanded anyone to be ungodly, and he has not given anyone permission to sin. Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, we speak a wisdom to those who are mature, though it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are being destroyed. But we speak God's wisdom, a hidden mystery, which God decreed before the ages for our glory, and which none of the rulers of this age understood. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But, as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder,' and 'whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no.' Anything more than this comes from the evil one." All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from the book of Sirach, and what's striking about this passage is how little it relies on divine micromanagement and how much it emphasizes human agency. The text doesn't portray people as puppets pulled along by fate or trapped by some pre-written destiny. Instead, it presents life as a series of real, consequential choices. From a humanistic perspective, this lands as a clear affirmation that moral responsibility belongs to us, not to tradition, not to authority, and not to unseen forces acting on our behalf. The imagery of placing fire and water in front of a person it's especially telling. Right? These aren't mysterious symbols that require some sort of special revelation to decode. They represent obvious alternatives with predictable outcomes. Fire burns, water sustains. The message isn't wait for divine instructions. The message is use your best judgment. That aligns very closely with the idea that ethical living depends on discernment. It depends on us paying attention to consequences, weighing harm and benefit, and then choosing paths that support both individual and collective well-being. There's also an important boundary drawn around freedom here. Choice is real, but it's not a free pass. The closing idea that no one is given permission to do harm, that undercuts the notion that freedom means acting without regard for others. Read secularly, this becomes a reminder that autonomy and accountability go together. Living freely still means living within shared ethical limits, because our choices don't happen in isolation. They ripple outward. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that our lives are shaped by the choices we make, and we are responsible for owning them. This passage presents a surprisingly grounded moral vision. We are free to choose, we are obligated to think, and we are responsible for the outcomes of our actions. It challenges us to stop outsourcing blame and stop waiting for permission to do what we know is right. Our lives are shaped by the choices we make, and we are responsible for owning them. Our second reading was from the first letter to the Corinthians, and this passage draws a sharp contrast between what's considered wise by those in power and a deeper kind of understanding that generally eludes them. Read humanistically, this isn't about secret knowledge handed down from above, but about epistemic humility. At the recognition that no generation, no system, and no authority has the final word on truth. History is full of examples where the most confident voices were later proven incomplete or just flat out wrong. Real wisdom begins when we admit that our understanding is always provisional. The critique of the rulers of this age is especially relevant today. Their failure isn't intellectual capacity necessarily. Their failure is moral blindness that's shaped by self-interest and preservation of their status. Look, when power defines what counts as truth, wisdom stagnates. Human progress, by contrast, often emerges from people willing to question prevailing norms, people willing to listen to marginalized voices, and willing to imagine alternatives that serve more than just the elite. Insight that benefits humanity rarely comes from protecting the status quo, because things can always be improved. The language about things no eye has seen doesn't need to point to a supernatural realm to be meaningful. It can just as easily speak to the vast, unexplored potential of human imagination and understanding. Every advance in science, ethics, and social cooperation once lived in that space beyond what had been seen or heard. At the same time, the passage acknowledges something deeply human, that meaning isn't just discovered externally. Our internal experiences, our reflections, our values, and our moral commitments, they all play a crucial role in shaping the kind of people we become. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that wisdom grows when we question power, stay curious, and remain open to what we do not yet know. This reading invites us to loosen our grip on inherited assumptions and resist equating authority with insight. It encourages humility, curiosity, and a willingness to imagine potential futures that are far better than the present. Wisdom grows when we question power, stay curious, and remain open to what we do not yet know. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Matthew. And this section of Matthew pushes hard against a checklist version of morality. The critique of the religious elite isn't really about theology. It's about mistaking compliance for character. Read humanistically, the challenge here is to move beyond rule avoidance and toward internal consistency. Ethical behavior isn't something we switch on when rules are enforced. Ethical behavior flows from who we are when no one is watching and nothing is being tallied. The pairing of anger with violence and lust with betrayal it's a bit provocative, but the underlying insight is psychologically sound. Harm rarely starts with action. Harm starts with unresolved resentment, objectification, or unchecked impulse. By drawing attention to the inner life, this reading points toward what we might call preventative ethics, and addressing emotional and cognitive patterns before they turn into behavior that damages relationships and communities. This is less about condemnation and more about self-awareness and personal responsibility. Now, the call to let one's yes mean yes and one's no mean no highlights the social importance of trust. When people rely on loopholes, technicalities, or performative promises that they don't really mean, these things that mean almost nothing, Trust erodes. A society functions best when honesty is ordinary, not ceremonial. Right? Clear speech, reliable commitments, and respect for others' dignity. Those things reduce the need for enforcement because integrity becomes the norm rather than the exception. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that integrity begins long before our actions. It starts with how we think, speak, and regard others. This passage reframes morality as an inside-out practice, one that's rooted in empathy, self-examination, and honesty rather than fear of punishment. It asks us to take responsibility, not just for what we do, but for the attitudes and intentions that shape our actions. Integrity begins long before our actions. It starts with how we think, speak, and regard others. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Sirach, the main lesson I came away with was our lives are shaped by the choices we make, and we are responsible for owning them. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was wisdom grows when we question power, stay curious, and remain open to what we do not yet know. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was integrity begins long before our actions. It starts with how we think, speak, and regard others. What ties these readings together is a quiet but radical shift in where authority actually lives. Across all three, the focus moves away from rule books, titles, and inherited power and turns squarely toward the inner life. How we choose, how we think, and how honestly we live. The message isn't that guidance or tradition are useless, but that none of them can substitute for personal responsibility. Wisdom doesn't come from standing close to power or checking the right boxes. Wisdom comes from doing the harder work of reflection, discernment, and self-alignment. Ethical living starts when we stop outsourcing our conscience and begin cultivating an internal compass, one grounded in reason, empathy, and integrity, so that our choices, our words, our actions all flow from the same place. That's what real maturity looks like. Not obedience driven by fear, but accountability, chosen freely and lived consistently. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this right now because these ideas aren't abstract or academic. They're showing up in our laws, our politics, and our daily lives, and the stakes are very real. These lessons matter because individual autonomy is under direct threat. Dominionist thinking argues that a particular religious vision should be enforced through the state, even when it strips rights from women, LGBTQ+ people, and religious minorities. The counter message here is simple but powerful. No one gets to make your moral choices for you. When morality is grounded in personal responsibility and human dignity, it resists being weaponized by people claiming divine authority over everyone else's lives. We should care because us versus them thinking thrives on false certainty. Nationalistic movements often claim access to a special or hidden truth that supposedly justifies excluding, demonizing, or even harming others. The humanist lesson pushes back hard on that impulse. It reminds us that complex problems require humility, curiosity, and multiple perspectives, not blind loyalty to a single ideological or religious worldview. That humility is essential in moments of unrest, when certainty becomes dangerous. This is all important because performative morality it's hollow and it's corrosive. We see leaders today using religious symbols as props while they're completely ignoring the ethical substance those symbols are meant to represent. The insistence on internal integrity, on honesty, consistency, and empathy, that calls out that hypocrisy. It says character matters more than your optics, and that no cause excuses cruelty, deception, or indifference to human suffering. We should care about this because democracy depends on this shift in our thinking. When morality is rooted in shared human values, rather than being something enforced because of belief, it creates space for pluralism, for people with different worldviews to coexist without fear. These lessons offer ethical armor against authoritarianism, reminding us that a healthy society isn't governed by domination or dogma. A healthy society is governed by reason, empathy, and accountability that's chosen freely. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, when the world feels loud, divided, and driven by power plays, it's easy to underestimate how much our everyday integrity actually matters. But trust, real trust, doesn't begin in courtrooms or capitals. It begins in ordinary moments, with ordinary people making clear and honest commitments and then living up to them. In times when words are routinely twisted or strategically vague, choosing clarity becomes a quiet form of resistance. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. Where in my life do my words and my actions drift out of alignment? And how can I correct that? Basically, what would it look like for my yes to truly mean yes and my no to truly mean no? This question matters because integrity isn't just a moral ideal. Integrity is a practical skill that shapes the quality of our relationships, our work, and our sense of self. When we say yes out of fear, guilt, or habit, we create resentment and eventually burnout. When we avoid saying no, we erode our own boundaries and invite confusion from other people. Years ago, I was working in a General Motors factory as a first-line supervisor on second shift. I was put in charge of an engine cradle assembly cell. Dirty, difficult welding work. And my assignment from my boss was simple. Improve productivity. Of course, my boss was very clear about how he wanted that done. He said, I expect you to go to war with the union. Penalize people who aren't doing their jobs. Be tough. So I followed his instructions, but not necessarily the spirit of them. Instead of picking fights, I started by learning. I got to know the people. I learned the jobs. I asked questions. I challenged things that didn't make sense. And most importantly, I set very clear expectations. What mattered, what didn't, and what would happen if lines were crossed. Once those expectations were unmistakable, then I enforced them. I didn't look the other way when rules were broken. I wrote penalties. I answered plenty of grievances. I argued with the union when I had to, and predictably, our production numbers took a nosedive as the people sort of rebelled against me. One afternoon, my boss was waiting for me when I came in. He said, "Okay, maybe going to war with the union wasn't the best idea. Do something different. We can't afford to miss our numbers and shut the assembly plant down again." The truth is, I didn't change my principles at all after that. The only thing I changed was how quickly I moved to formal discipline. I talked more first. I listened. But my standards stayed exactly the same. I kept doing what I'd been doing all along. I kept being clear, being fair, and treating people with dignity. When someone did good work, I said so. When someone messed up, I addressed it directly. No games, no favoritism, no mixed signals. The work was hard and messy, but it mattered, and I made sure people knew that I respected what they were doing. 10 months later, when I transferred to another job, that crew threw me a going-away party with catered food and everything. The other foremen were stunned. Apparently, that had never happened before. The difference came down to integrity. My yes was always yes. My no was always a no. People didn't always like the decisions, but they trusted them. And that trust changed everything. So spend some time with our question this week. Where in my life do my words and my actions drift out of alignment? And how can I correct that? What would it look like for my yes to really mean yes and my no to truly mean no? Taking time to reflect on where your commitments are clear and where they aren't helps you make decisions more intentionally. Over time, this kind of honesty builds trust, it reduces stress, and it allows you to live with greater consistency and confidence, knowing that your words carry real weight. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. In the classic Chinese text, Analects, Confucius wrote, "The superior person is modest in speech, but exceeds in action." This quote lands squarely in the space we've been exploring this week. Confucius isn't praising silence or passivity. He's naming the gap that tends to open up between what we say and what we actually do. In everyday life, words are pretty cheap. Promises, declarations, and moral posturing, that's all easy. What's rare and far more valuable is follow-through. When our actions consistently back up our words, trust grows. When they don't, trust erodes. This connects directly to the question we're sitting with, whether our yes truly means yes and our no truly mean no. Modest speech doesn't mean weak conviction. It means refusing to overpromise, refusing to posture, and refusing to say what sounds good if we don't intend to live it out. The superior person is modest in speech, but exceeds in action. Exceeding in action is what integrity looks like on the ground. Clear boundaries, honest commitments, and behavior that aligns with our stated values. Reflecting on this quote helps us notice where we might be talking more than we're doing, and where tightening that alignment could make our lives simpler, more trustworthy, and more grounded. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that wisdom comes from doing the hard work of reflection, discernment, and self-alignment. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, copyright 2021, National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States of America, used by permission, all rights reserved, worldwide. Thanks again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.